Okay, we're going to learn Farbrengen that Rabbi gave in 1960 in Shabbos Bereishis. The previous Rabbi said that you have to live with the parsha of the week. And he then spoke about Parshas Bereishis. He said Parshas Bereishis is a joyous week. One second. It's a joyous week, even though, because Hashem saw the whole creation is good, and even though the end of the parsha is a little negative, but in general, Parshas Bereishis is a joyous week. And by all the Jewish people, Shabbos Bereishis is joy and gladness, because we start the Torah anew. From all this is understood that Shabbos Bereishis has the same theme as Simchas Torah, because also on Simchas Torah, we begin reading the Torah anew. As the Jewish custom is that as soon as you finish reading the last words of the Torah, you right away begin again from Bereishis Bara. So just like there's a tremendous joy in Simchas Torah, because the Torah tells us to ascend in holiness, so Simchas Torah is a greater joy than the joy of Sukkot and Simchas Beis HaShe'eva. And it says about Simchas Beis HaShe'eva, whoever did not see the joy of the drawing of the water never saw joy in his life. So Simchas Torah is even beyond the joy of Simchas Beis HaShe'eva. So Ma'al Makodesh, have to add in joy, so the Simcha, that we begin the Torah anew on Simchas Torah is even greater. So now Shabbos Bereishis, which is a continuation of Simchas Torah, is even more than Simchas Torah, because it's always supposed to add in holiness. I just want to interject over here, in this Farbrengen that the Rebbe is sharing on the Shabbos Bereishis, he is quoting from things he said in Simchas Torah. One of the things that stuck out to me was that the Rebbe says that there's 5 levels of joy. There's the joy of a Yontiv in general. There's an additional joy on Sukkot. There's an additional joy of Simchas Beis HaShe'eva. There's an additional joy of Shmini Atzeres. And then there's additional joy of Simchas Torah. And these 5 levels of joy correspond to the 5 levels of the soul and to the 5 prayers on Yom Kippur. Everything that begins in the first half of the month of Tishrei in a more serious, more somber way is revealed on Sukkot in a joyous way. So the Rebbe said, where do we see the 5 prayers of Yom Kippur on Sukkot? The 5 prayers of Yom Kippur correspond to the 5 levels of joy that we experience on Sukkot. So you have 5 prayers, and the 5th prayer is Ne'ilah, which corresponds to the deepest part of the neshama. So the 5th part of Yom Kippur corresponds to the 5th level of joy, the joy of Simchas Torah. Because the joy, again, of Sukkot is beyond the joy of a regular Yom Tov. The joy of Simchas Beis HaShe'eva is beyond the joy of Sukkot. The joy of Shmini Atzeres is beyond the joy of Simchas Beis HaShe'eva. And the joy of Simchas Torah is beyond that. That's a 5th level of joy. And since it's all in revealed in Simchas Torah, and it's really beyond the 5th level, beyond the 5th level of Neshama, higher than the level of Yechida. And that's why it's able to be able to include all different levels of the soul. So Simchas Torah, the Rebbe says in that Farbrengen is beyond the level of Yechida. And here the Rebbe says that Shabbos Bereishis is beyond that. So just want to give some context to what the Rebbe is referring to. We're talking something really amazing. So this will help us understand why the previous Rebbe said that Shabbos Bereishis is something that all the Jews celebrate in a way of joy and gladness. It seems that Chassidus always delineates the difference between Shabbos and Yontiv, that Yontiv is called a time for joy, and Shabbos is called a time for pleasure. So why do we say that Shabbos Bereishis is a time of joy? It's seemingly joy is something associated with Yontiv, and Shabbos associated with pleasure. So the answer is because Shabbos Bereishis is the same theme and is a continuation of Simchas Torah. Therefore, Shabbos Bereishis is different than all the Shabbosim, and besides the fact that Shabbos Bereishis has an element of joy, Shabbos Bereishis also has an element of Simcha. Now, every Shabbos also has an element of Simcha too, as Rebbe discussed in the Farbrengen in Simchas Torah in the same year. We're not going to get into that, but whatever element of joy that's reserved for Yontif also exists in Shabbos Bereishis. And in general, Shabbos Bereishis is a time to catch up for all that was missed in the month of Tishrei. In the Chazan on Shabbos Bereishis is meant to bring in all different tunes from throughout the month of Tishrei. I don't know this from something I've heard myself directly from a source, but I've heard it said that Chazan Talashevsky I've heard Chazan Talashevsky on Shabbos Bereishis and how he puts in, he very amazingly weaves all the songs of Tishrei into the Shabbos davening. But I heard that he put in a piece of Chazanis from Kol Nidre, and I heard the Rebbe shook, this was too much, bring back too much of a different kind of energy. Either way, so Shabbos Bereishis is this theme of joy, like the theme of Simchas Torah, and that's why the previous Rebbe calls it a day of joy and gladness, not like a regular Shabbos. So the words of tzaddikim, and especially our Rabbi, are very precise, especially things that are printed. So the joy, the previous Rebbe says, Sasein v'simcha, gladness and joy. So the Torah tells us to always ascend in holiness. So that means that the joy of Shabbos Bereishis has all of the previous elements of the previous holidays. And the Torah says that when you ever have $200 includes within it $100. So besides the fact that it has all the elements of joy in it, it also has something else called sasein. Sasein is gladness, and that's a verse. That word gladness comes from a verse, and they should draw the water with gladness. So it has element of gladness and also the element of Simchas Torah. So what's the difference between gladness and joy? The previous Shabbos says on Shabbos Bereishis, not just joy, there's gladness. Gladness is something that comes from above to below, and joy is something that ascends from below to above. In the spheres, joy and gladness are different parts of the divine revelations in Atzilus. Gladness, sasein, is a sphere of Yosod, which the sphere of Yosod is still considered part of the infinite worlds, something which is given from above to below. And simcha is Nesira Malchus, from below to above. That's the general theme of the title that we give the holiday of Sukkot. We call the holiday of Sukkot a time of our joy. It's a time when God rejoices with his creations, and it's a time when we rejoice with God. So both of these items come in the simcha of ourselves. In other words, okay, so in other words, in our joy, in our simcha itself, that we rejoice in God, there are two elements. There is joy and there's gladness, and they are connected to the two spheres of Yesod and Malchus. This will help us understand why the Gemara says in Sukkah that there were two tzeddukim. Tzeddukim are people who only believe in the written Torah, not the oral Torah. So one of them was Sasein, and the other one's name was joy. One of them's name was gladness, the other one's name was joy. And the Gemara says that what they said about the joy, the drawing of the water, because the drawing of the water is something that's derived from the oral Torah, they didn't believe in it. So the Gemara discusses what they said and what they were responded to by our sages. So the question is, who cares what they said? Whatever happened, happened. So the answer is that there are two names of Sasin and Simcha. They are the two elements of above to below and below to above. So on Shabbos Bereishis, the simcha comes out and is expressed in all kinds of ways, both from above to below in sussing, and both from below to above in joy. And because of all of these things come together, so we have something beyond of what error was before. In other words, when you have a fusion of various things, so then in order to fuse those things together, there has to be something higher that puts them together. So the classic example Chassidus gives is of every word in Hebrew. Every word is comprised of many letters. So each letter is expression of one kind of revelation. But in order to put them together in a word, you have to have something higher in that word that joins together the various elements of the various letters. So because Shabbos Bereishis has in it both joy and gladness, that means that Shabbos Bereishis is beyond them both. So because Shabbos Bereishis carries the same theme as Simchas Torah, because this Shabbos Bereishis is different than all other Shabbos. Besides the element that Shabbos Bereishis has joy in it, like a Yontif does, like I mentioned before. Besides that, there's a difference also in the Shabbos Bereishis that sets it apart from all the Shabbosim in the following. Every Shabbos is connected to the days before it and the days after it. Shabbos Bereishis affects all days of the year, because since Shabbos Bereishis it has the same theme as Simchas Torah, so just like on Simchas Torah we have this wish and we bless each other that we should continue the Simcha of Simchas Torah throughout the year, so also Shabbos Bereishis, you have to draw down from Shabbos Bereishis for the whole year. Like the previous Rebbe said in the Sikha, that the way you approach Shabbos Bereishis, that's the way the whole year continues. So in order to be able to, this halacha, the halachic term for something which is wet is tefech masat tefech. It has to be wet enough to make something else wet. So if Shabbos Bereishis is meant to moisten all the days of the year, it must be that there's a lot of moisture in the Shabbos, a lot of lachluchas, a lot of moisture, and that's why it's able to moisten all the Shabbosim. So it has to have a lot of lachluchas, a lot of moisture. So Hashem should give that we should have deya bina v'haskel. We should have wisdom, chacham bina v'das, to understand, to use out Shabbos Bereishis, that it should be a channel for the whole year, to continue the idea of ufaratzta for the entire year. Ufaratzta, that we're all familiar with, the idea of spreading Yiddishkeit and Chassidus around the world, is something the Rebbe initiated in this the year of the Farbrengen that we're learning, Tashin Chaf, 1960. So we should continue. We should have the seichel. We should have the intelligence to know to use our Shabbos Bereishis to do ufaratza throughout the year. I want to point out another point that they mentioned in the previous Farbrengens of this year. It says in the Talmud that every day a voice comes out from Mount Sinai and says, "Woe is to the creatures because of the shame of the Torah, that the Torah has no one involved in it." So the Baal Shem Tov says, what's the point of a voice that no one hears? And the Baal Shem Tov answers that there's a part of our neshama that hears the voice. The main part of ourselves hears the voice. And that tickles it, and that arouses it to do something. And what is the voice saying? It doesn't say people don't learn the Torah. It says people aren't involved in Torah, which means they're not involved in spreading and sharing the Torah. So Rebbe says that this voice happens every day. Every day, it says in the Talmud, a voice comes out from Mount Sinai. But there is a day of the year when this voice is like, it's just like the Torah. Hashem gives us the Torah every day, but there's a special day of the year, Shavuos, when that's a source of the celebration of the Torah all year. So too, the time that Hashem asks us, "What's going on with the Torah? What are you guys doing about my Torah?" is on Simchas Torah. So that's this idea of ufaratzta. We should use out the time. Is not just relevant to Tafshin Chav. And the Rabbi began this campaign of ufaratzta, but there's a special request of Hashem at this time of year on Shabbos Bereishis and Simchas Torah. What's going on with her? What are you doing to spread my Torah? So we have to have the seichel, Rabbi says, to use our Shabbos Bereishis to spread the Torah, to break through all limitations. And we have ufaratzta. not only our boundaries in the mundane, but also the boundaries of holiness. And we should draw down a lot more than Hashem has written and sealed for us. I don't know if Zev's listening. Zev, you listening? Listen to what the Rebbe says. The Gemara says that all of the parnasa that a person is supposed to earn is decreed on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, except for whatever you spend for education, whatever you spend for Shabbos and Yontif. That means that Shabbos, That means that Shabbos and Yontif could accomplish more than whatever has been ordained on Yom Kippur. And since Shabbos Bereishis has an effect on the whole year, so Shabbos Bereishis, we're able to draw down more than Hashem has written and sealed for us throughout the year. That should be ufaratzi yom came and svayim and in the previous Farbrengen, the Farbrengen of Simchas Torah, the Farbrengen of Simchas Torah, they've actually said that just like the Gemara says, there are some things which are an exception to the rule that aren't considered part of the rule of Hashem giving the budget for every person throughout the year, like the expenses that they spend for Shabbos. So too, it says that decisions we make at Simchas Torah to add in Parnas, add in Staka, it says it opens up new pipelines to be able to earn lots and lots more money to be able to fulfill those pleasures. In a similar way, that it says about this Shabbos, that this Shabbos draws down beyond what was written in Sil Yom Kippur, and that should be ufaratz to beyond all limitations. Chaim Reb Zev, since you're the only guy with the screen open, I want to wish you a bracha. Should have open brachas from Hashem. Okay, Dr. Bressman's getting jealous. You too, Dr. Bressman. You too, David. Teva nirva nigla ufaratz l'chaim.
Chaim, shkoyach.
So this idea of ufaratsta, this idea of breaking through boundaries, this has to happen by every single person. And since the world rests on three things, it doesn't only mean the physical world, but also means that every person's individual world is rests on three things. So there has to be ufaratsta in all three pillars. There are three pillars that my personal world stands on, not just the world at large, but my small world stands on three pillars. So I have to break through the boundaries in the three pillars that my world stands on. So it's understood in a simple sense that you can't make an infinite building if the pillars are limited. So there must be ufaratsta to break through the boundaries you have in all three pillars. And only then can there be ufaratsta in your small world, and ufaratsta breaking through the boundaries of the world at large. So the idea of ufaratsta in Torah, prayer, and kindness means, as I've discussed in other Farbrengens of this year, Tafshin Chaf, in service of Hashem and davening, the Rebbe said that there is a positive mitzvah to daven. Whether the mitzvah is to ask for your needs, or the mitzvah is to serve God with your heart, as the Rambam says, but that's limited. Also, when you're asking for your needs, it's only meant to ask, if the mitzvah is to ask for your needs, mitzvah only applies when you need something. It's limited. And also, if you say the mitzvah is to work and serve God with your heart, so the commentaries say you are able to fulfill this obligation of serving God with your heart once every so often. But that's the specific detail of davening. But then there is what the Alter Rebbe said, that davening is the spine that gives energy to all the limbs of the body. So that's the infinite idea of davening. That's what Rabbi Yochanan meant when he said, Halavai, I wish a person should daven all day, and whenever a person has a moment, he has to fill it with the content of davening, which is connection to Hashem. That's what the Alter Rebbe is. Davening isn't just something that you are obligated to do every so often when you need something, when you have to once in a while to serve God with your heart. Rather, davening, Alter Rebbe says, is the spine that gives energy to all of your Judaism. What does davening mean? Your connection to Hashem. The Rebbe doesn't mention it here, but on another occasion, the Rebbe said that the Alter Rebbe said, and anyone who says that davening is not a biblical commandment has never seen light in their life. But just as a side note, that the point that we're saying here is that davening shouldn't be something that we look at just as an obligation to do because we need something or because we're supposed to serve Hashem with our heart every so often. Davening is what makes everything tick in your life. And therefore, if you have a moment, you have to fill it with the theme of davening, which is make a connection to Hashem. And so too, the pillar of tzedakah, the pillar of kindness. The Rebbe had explained in the Farbrengen of that year that there is a positive commandment of tzedakah, which has limitation. Whether the limitation is meiser, 10% or 20%, but then there is an element of tzedakah which is infinite, and that is the idea of how it says in Tanya that you're able to cause a rectification from all blemishes with tzedakah. But tzedakah freik, you're able to fix up all the blemishes you have in all mitzvahs through and all decrees chas v'shalom that are set against the person. You're able to get rid of all that stuff through the tzedakah. Because of this, this proves that tzedakah has a general theme, and therefore tzedakah has no limitations. Because just like you give anything you had for doctor bills, it says in Tanya, so too, how much more so to make your soul complete? How much more so does it make sense to give beyond all limitations? So too, there's the idea of ufaratz in our Torah study. You might want to say that learning Torah is like the whole discussion about why ufaratz applies to Torah. We have 4 minutes. Let's see whoever can last 4 minutes. Let's try to do this. What's the idea of ufaratz in Torah study? So Torah study has this unique quality that Torah brings to mitzvahs. So therefore, you might say that Torah is considered like an action because Torah brings to action. And therefore, since Torah brings to action, it's just like we said before about davening. Davening is the spine of all of Yiddishkeit. Therefore, it has to have an infinite element in it because it has to empower all Yiddishkeit. You might want to say the same thing about Torah, but the Rebbe is not satisfied with this for a number of reasons. Reason number one: even the Torah study that brings to action, even that element of Torah study, is part of the mitzvah of Torah study. So it's not a general infinite theme. Because if it would be a general infinite theme, it wouldn't be included in the number of mitzvahs. Whatever is, in other words, if there is a specific definition for it, and it's called a mitzvah, it's not infinite. Since Torah study, although it brings to mitzvahs, there's a mitzvah to study Torah, there's a limitation in it. Number two, just because you're studying Torah doesn't mean that it will bring to action by yourself. It could be that another person will learn Torah and scream out in every corner of the world, whatever the halacha is. So, in other words, it's possible someone else's learning will bring to my action. They'll learn the Torah, and they're going to scream to everybody what the halacha is. So it's not necessary for every person, it seems, to learn to bring to action, but ufaratz has to happen to every person. Number three, even if you won't rely on the head of the Sanhedrin, but you yourself will study the halachas, nevertheless, it's still limited. The author writes in Talmud Torah, it's possible to learn the entire Torah, that's how it's pertinent to action. You can know everything Torah says to you about what you need to do. So it takes a certain amount of time. You learn the whole code of Jewish law. And now you know all the Torah wants you to do. So there's limitation. It's not ufaratzta. So what's the ufaratzta in Torah study? It can't be about the fact that Torah affects our behavior and we need to know what to do. If we're going to study the Torah to know what to do, there must be another element in Torah which is ufaratzta. What is the ufaratzta in Torah? The Gemara says there are some people, like Rabbi Shimon Yochai and those and his choice students, that Torah was their profession. It wasn't the mitzvah of Torah. The mitzvah of Torah could be fulfilled by learning part of the day and working the rest of the day. Having a set time to study Torah. Or even more, the Torah says that that what has to be permanent to you is your Torah study, and your work is supposed to be, it doesn't matter how much time you spend working, but what's meant to be the part of the day that's permanent is your Torah study, and the part of the day you spend working is supposed to be lighter. It's arai, it's temporary. But that's not the level of Shimon Yochai. Shimon Yochai achieved a level where Torah was his profession. They had no other thing in their life. Their whole life was just Torah study. So that wasn't because the mitzvah of Torah, that was beyond the mitzvah of Torah. So in a similar way, it's possible for each of us to put ourselves in that category of Rabbi Shimon Yochai students, that when you study Torah, that's all that's going on in your life. Just like we said before about davening, that you should daven all day. What does that mean? That davening is you. So that when you have a chance to connect to Hashem, you connect to Hashem. A chance to study Torah, you study Torah, because that's who you are. So they're saying basically that, I understood it correctly, the ufaratz and Torah study means that Torah becomes your thing. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're not doing anything else, but that's you. That becomes who you are. And that's why the Torah says that if Torah is your thing, you're exempt from davening, because ufaratzta, this is the ufaratzta element in Torah, which can be exchanged to the ufaratzta in tefillah. In other words, there is an element of Torah study which is similar to ufaratzta in tefillah, which means that every moment we have, we need to catch and study from Torah in it, because if Torah becomes who you are, then automatically you have a chance, you chaperein of our Torah, and you chaperein a moment with Hashem, to connect with Hashem in davening, and you chaperein, and because it's you, foratzta, you're going beyond your limitations and you're identifying with Hashem. L'chaim avrocha, and uforatzta yom v'keima by each of us in Torah, tefillah, and staka, and uforatzta in the world, we should see it happen. Chaim.
That's good.
I miss you. Good to see your face.
When are you out of quarantine?
To speak to Dr. Hakimi, I don't know. It's complicated, because after one person in my family stopped being contagious, then the next person became contagious. Then, so positive.
What's your next info story?
Chaim.